The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Profound Logic webinar on making rich application interfaces responsive. My name is Amanda Blackburn. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Profound Logic, and today I'm joined with Brian May. He's our Director of Pre-Sales and Customer Solutions at Profound Logic Software. Now, before we get started with the webinar, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. I wanted to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded. So no worries if you want to share this with the rest of your team. We will share this with you afterwards and you can watch it at your leisure. We will also send you a follow-up email that has some code samples from what Brian's going to cover today. So keep an eye out for that. Throughout the presentation, you can answer or you can ask questions using the GoToWebinar interface. Over on the right-hand side, you should see a box that says questions, and you can enter those in any time throughout the presentation, and our team will be on hand to answer those. And then after the webinar presentation, Brian will try to answer as many questions as he can before the end of the presentation. And then also, after you close out the webinar, you will be prompted to take a post-webinar survey. This is very helpful for us because it lets us know how we performed today and if there's any areas where we can improve. So with all of that out of the way, I will turn things over to Brian.
Thanks, Amanda. I want to take a minute and say hello to everyone and thank you for joining our webinar today. I chose this topic for a few reasons. It's been a little while since we've done a deeply technical webinar, so we decided that this would be a good opportunity to put something like this in. And when we were discussing a topic internally, one topic that keeps coming up on our support queue as well as when I'm talking to customers is more and more customers are wanting to have responsive applications. So what exactly does responsive mean? Well, responsive applications are applications that can dynamically transform based on the size of the device that they're running on. So before we take a deep dive into into responsive design and how that applies in the Profound UI environment, I want to take a quick poll of all of you that are here. And this will just give me a little bit of an idea of the audience that we're talking to. That way I can make sure that I am, not going overly technical or underly technical as we go through the various slides. All right. And it looks like almost everyone has voted at this point, so we'll go ahead and close out the poll and see what the results look like. So at this point, it seems that well over 3/4 of you are all currently using Profound UI in your organization. And this webinar is really geared for you. For those of you that aren't using Profound UI at this point, you should still be able to follow along, so don't be discouraged by that fact. So that gives me a good insight, so I appreciate everyone answering the poll. So let's talk a little bit about the Profound UI environment and how it works. So one of the key elements of Profound UI is our visual designer. So inside the visual designer, it allows our customers to be able to drag and drop and build new user interfaces for their applications. Because of the way it's designed, by default, the elements that you place on your user interface are in fixed positions. And there's a few different reasons for this. One, it's the simplest method that we have for implementing interfaces, especially when we're working with developers who may have never done any type of rich UI type development. when we have developers that may be coming from a green screen world and they've never done any web development or any type of GUI development at all. Getting into things like relative positioning and responsiveness is quite a large step for many of them. So by default, when you start working inside the Visual Designer, things are going to be in fixed positions. That way, when you add something to your UI, you place it in a very specific position, and that's exactly where it's going to be. There's no guesswork at all involved in laying out that user interface. And this is what allows us to have that true WYSIWYG designer. WYSIWYG being what you see is what you get. Unfortunately, the problem with having the user interfaces being done in this fixed positioning is that it's not responsive. So for the majority of our customers, that's okay. Many of our customers are building user interfaces for business applications, for line of business that will be used by their users at their desks, on their PCs or Macs or whatever their desktop computing platform is. They're all going to have, you know, fairly large widescreen monitors, and fixed positioning is not going to be an issue for them. And so that fixed positioning just makes everyone's life simple for most cases. When it becomes a problem is when you have a particular application that you want to be accessed not only from a desktop but also from, say, a tablet or a mobile phone. While they'll certainly display, tablets do okay with it, with minimal scrolling versus a desktop. But when you move to something as small as a mobile device like a phone, then suddenly that content's just not going to fit, and it's going to require lots of scrolling right and left and up and down in order to get to all of the content, and that's when it becomes very unfriendly for the users. Now, the Profound UI framework has always had the ability to size and position things relatively. Almost all of the elements in the Visual Designer can be positioned relatively. Relative meaning that we can actually set those positions, instead of being at a fixed pixel position, we can actually set them to be positioned relative to their containers. So, for example, we can replace the fixed values for position, height, width. We can replace those with percentages, so that based on the size of the device, the size of the element on the screen will change. So that's very easy to do, and we're actually going to do that in our demonstration. Another thing that you can do to help with the overall responsiveness of your applications is with your font sizes. By default, font sizes are done in pixels. That's just sort of the standard. But there is a different unit of measure for font sizes that you should be aware of. It's an EM or an M. And an M is a relative size for your fonts. And basically, it is a proportional size. So 1 EM is equal to whatever the default font size is for that device. 1.5 EM is 50% larger than that. 0.75 EM, of course, would be 25% smaller than the default font size. So by using EMs, what that does is that actually makes the text on your user interface be sized appropriately no matter what type of device that it's on. So not only does that matter when you're talking about mobile devices, but as some of us get older, we may go into, even on our desktops, we may go in and change the default font sizes inside of Windows or inside of the Mac OS so that text is bigger, so it's easier for us to see. EMs will use whatever the default is set in the operating system. So if I set my computer to have larger text by default, then the text in my user interface would also have that larger text if I'm using EMs for my unit of measure when I'm doing my fonts. The other piece of the puzzle when we're talking about building responsive displays inside of the Profound UI framework are the use of layouts. We have several different layout widgets within the framework. We're going to use those during the demonstration here, but they are the key in order to having content be properly grouped and be able to properly resize itself based on the size of our device. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into a little bit of the demonstration. As Amanda mentioned, there's going to be lots of code involved in our demonstration today. Again, it's going to be very technical. All of this code will be made available after the webinar. I've actually got to pull it all together and do some install instructions because there are going to be various parts of the code that will need to be installed in certain places, but the installable code will all be available to you once the webinar is available for download. So with that, let's talk a little bit about our application and building responsive applications. So in this case, I am going to be doing a very simple application, and let me go ahead and pull that up, where we just have some basic product information. I have just a product information page here that I've built with just some basic product information here on the right, an image of that product, and then a list of features underneath. I didn't want to have an overly complicated user interface for the webinar because I really want to concentrate on the concepts and not all of the minuscule details of all the different types of elements we could possibly be using. So this is our very simple application. It is an RPG application. We can actually pull up that RPG code right here inside of Rational Developer. Again, the RPG code will be included, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the actual code. Just know that it's a very simple RPG application that's just pulling information out of a products file and displaying it on the screen. So let's come to our visual designer. So if we wanted to build a responsive user interface for our application, there are a few things that we should do from the beginning. The very first thing that I do when I'm building a responsive application is I actually go in under the layouts section in the visual designer. I'm going to grab a simple container layout. I'm going to place that onto the screen, and then here in the properties, I'm actually going to remove the left and the top properties, and I'm going to set the height and width to 100%. And basically what this does is it gives me a container that automatically fills the screen, no matter what size that screen is. Now that I have this overarching container, as I put elements inside of it, I can actually position and size those elements relative to this parent container. Once I've done that, I generally will lay out various sections of the screen. So in this particular application, when we looked at it, we had an image here on the left, we had some product information on the right, and we had this grid at the bottom with our listing of features. So generally speaking, I'm going to just go ahead and set up various sections to house those different pieces of data. So I can grab another container layout, place it here on the left, place one on the right, and then maybe place another one at the bottom. But on these particular layouts, I'm actually going to position them relatively to the parent container. So instead of having a left position of 75%, perhaps I'll set that to a 5%. And the top, we'll set that to 10%. Our height and width, let's go with 40% for each. And I can repeat that with the other sections in the layout here. If we switch over, you can see I actually have the application already pulled up here in the Visual Designer. So as you can see, I've done the same thing here. So I have a section here on the left, And inside of that, I've put an image widget. If we take a look at the properties of that image widget, you can see that I've set its max height and width to 100% so that it's designed to fill up the container here that I've put it inside of. I used the max height and width instead of the regular height and width properties because I want it to fill it up, but I don't want it to actually stretch. If you use the normal height and width properties, it will force the height and width to be that value, and that's not what I want to do. I want the image to actually scale. Here in the right section where I have my product information, I've actually used a different type of layout inside of this layout, and that is the table layout. That can be done, and I'll switch to my blank canvas here. Just by dragging that table layout into that container, I can set it to stretch by clicking the icon at the top right corner, and then I can set the number of rows and columns that I want. In this case, I had 2 columns, and maybe I want 4 rows. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I have these smaller containers that I can put my labels and my data elements in so that I know that they'll always line up properly. So if we take a look again at what I've done here, you'll see that I have 4 rows and 2 columns. My labels are in the first column. My data elements are actually in the second columns, and I can add those just by dragging them in. If you look at the properties of those, you'll see that they are also being positioned and sized relative to the container that they're in. So they're actually relative to the individual cell inside of this table. Now for the grid here at the bottom, the only thing I need to do is grab the mobile subfile grid widget and drag that into the container that I've set up at the bottom. It will automatically stretch itself out to fill the container that it's within. And then I've, of course, added in my data elements for it as well. And as you can see, they're also set relative to the size of the grid itself. So what we end up with, once we save and compile this and we run it, is the application that you see running here. Everything you'll see is spaced out evenly because we're using the table on the right side. I intentionally didn't add borders because I wanted the interface to be very clean. But as you'll see, if we resize the window, the content of this application will resize. The mobile grid that we're using will actually add and remove rows based on its height. The image here on the left will actually resize itself based on the amount of area that's available to it. And the product data that we have here on the right will actually move as well based on the amount of information, the amount of space that we give it. So if I make this shorter, you'll see that the product information there will actually move closer together as those cells that they are within start to contract. So for many applications, this is sufficient. This is all we need to do. And we can do that all from right within the Visual Designer. Now, there are some limitations to doing our responsive design this way. The largest limitation is once you start reducing the size beyond a certain point, you'll notice that the labels and the data over there in my table on the right start to be cut off because they're overrunning the size of their containers. Now, there are a few different ways to deal with this, but all of those different ways will include the use of CSS. So it's important to remember that all of the elements within the Profound UI framework can be positioned and sized using CSS. So by removing the settings for the relative positioning from the Visual Designer and moving them into CSS classes, that gives us much more flexibility in the things that we can do. Remember that anything that is actually set in the Visual Designer will always override your CSS settings. So if you're going to move if you're going to move the positioning and sizing into a CSS class, be sure to remove those properties from the visual designer or they just won't work. The last piece we're going to look at when we start examining making this application responsive with CSS is we're actually going to take a look at CSS media queries. Now, CSS media queries, what they are is a mechanism within CSS that actually allows us to have a different set of rules, a different set of CSS classes based on certain conditions. In this case, we'll be conditioning on the width of the actual screen that we're running on. So if we take a look at that same application and we move all of this sizing information out into CSS, you'll see it's actually very simple to do, first of all, and then we'll see some of the things that we can actually do when we make that switch. So in moving back to our visual designer here, if I were going to take, say, this container here on the left, and I wanted to actually move its information out to CSS, what I would do is I would create a new CSS class. I actually have the CSS classes already written here. So in this case, I've created a new class called responsive left. And I've put this CSS inside of a CSS file inside of my custom CSS folder inside the Profound UI web docs. And any CSS files that are in that folder get automatically loaded when Profound UI loads. So I know these will be applied automatically on my screens. So I have a new class called responsive left, and you'll notice that I have left 5%, top 10%, width 40%, height 40%, which is exactly the same as the settings I have here in the properties. So now that I've done that, what I will do is I will add a CSS class. I can add the responsive left CSS class. And I will remove these hard-coded properties. If I've done this properly, we won't see this container move at all inside the visual designer. So I can remove the left property, and I can right-click and remove the top property. Still no movement. I can blank out my height and blank out my width. Now that that's done, nothing moved, so I know that I've set up my CSS class properly. And so now the positioning and sizing of this element is being controlled with that CSS class. If we move to the second record format in this display file, I've actually already set up all of these different containers to be CSS controlled. So the first one that we just did, if we take a look at the container here on the right, you'll see I've created a CSS class called responsive right. And then for my section at the bottom, I've created one called responsive bottom. And of course, those CSS rules are right here. Now, the second part of this is you'll notice this line in the CSS file. The @media token here tells it sets up a media query within CSS. Only screen means that this CSS only applies to content that's being displayed on a screen. Now you can have media queries in different CSS rules for different media. So for example, the most commonly used one other than screen would be print. So you can have, when you're printing something, you can have a completely different set of CSS for content that's being printed from the browser. So we're saying only for screens, and for screens with a minimum width of 768 pixels, we're using these CSS rules. So these are the original rules we had on the first version of this demonstration. Now above here, I have my default rules. So that being, these are the settings that I have for content that is for screens that are smaller than 768 pixels. So generally that will be tablets or actually generally that would be phones when you start getting that small. So what I've done here is I've kept my widths all relative, but you'll notice that my top positioning and my heights, I've switched those back to fixed positioning. Why have I done that? Because generally when you're working on a smaller mobile device, you'd never want to have to scroll right and left. But we all instinctively scroll up and down on a mobile application. So what I've done is I've actually set up these rules so that the product information that was originally on the right side of the screen, I've actually moved that underneath the image section of the screen. So I've taken the information and I've changed the flow. So you'll notice that I'm starting at 50 pixels at the top. I'm leaving room for that exit button that I had at the top of the application. I'm setting my max width to 90% of the entire screen, whatever size that might be. The width inherit, what that means is that I want the container to have whatever width the contents have. So in this case, we're talking about that image. So we want to make sure that we leave enough room inside of there for that image to fit. And I've set my height to 250 pixels. For responsive right, which was my content that was on the right side, instead of positioning it based on the right, I'm now positioning it based on the left. So 5% from the left edge. I'm starting it at 300 pixels, so 50 pixels plus 250 pixels. Start at 300 pixels. I'm setting it to 90% of the width of the screen, and I'm giving it a fixed height of 150 pixels. And then of course for the bottom, I'm setting my top at 475 to leave enough room for all of this content that's above, and setting a fixed height of 300 pixels so that my mobile device knows where to stop scrolling. So these are my default rules, and then my media query rules will kick in only if the width is above 768 pixels. Now, I haven't made any changes to this application other than applying the CSS classes and removing the hard-coded settings. So let's take a look at what happens with this application once we've done this. So I'll switch back to my demonstration here, and we'll go, instead of to the program called Response, we'll go to Response 2. Again, when we're in full screen mode, this application looks exactly the same. However, when we get ready to start resizing this, you'll notice there will come a point, everything will continue to scale, and then there will come a point where it won't fit anymore, and the product information will actually scoot underneath the image. And so now if I were viewing this on a phone, which would be of course an interface that is more narrow and long, as you can see now all of the information is still going to fit, and I'll be able to scroll up and down for any content that is off screen. Now, when we start talking about media queries, really the sky's the limit on what you can do with these. Now, I've done something very simple with this one, and that's just taking some content that's on the screen and moving it to a new location so that it fits within the parameters. But you're not limited to that. You can apply any CSS styling that you can imagine inside of those media queries. So, for example, maybe you have some content that isn't quite as important, and it's nice to show on a desktop application, but if this screen is being viewed on a phone, maybe you don't want to take up the real estate to show that information. Well, you could apply a CSS class to those less important elements and call that whatever you want. You could call it, responsive hide, and then in that you could set their visibility in the CSS rules to hidden. And so then once you were on a screen that was below a certain size, those elements would not display at all. They would just disappear. And so now you can not only control the organization of that content, now we can decide whether or not we want to even display content based on the size of a screen. So again, for most uses, this is all you need. With a combination of your Profound UI environment and CSS and media queries, there's really nothing limiting what you can do as far as a responsive application is concerned. Now, one of the most common questions we've gotten lately is from customers who already have a framework that they use for responsive applications. By far the most popular being Bootstrap. We get questions about, can we use Bootstrap, very regularly. So what is Bootstrap? Well, if we switch over here to Bootstrap's website, they have self-proclaimed that they are the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework for developing responsive, mobile-first projects on the web. Now, I cannot neither confirm or deny that claim. I can tell you that Bootstrap is very popular. We're not going to go into all of the inner workings of what Bootstrap is and how it all works. But again, we are actually going to use Bootstrap for the next section of our demonstration. And in order to do that, we're actually going to use a brand new feature that is being introduced in Profound UI 5.8. 5.8 is not out just yet, but it is coming very, very soon. You will definitely see it in the coming weeks. And this new feature in 5.8 that we're going to be using today is called EJS templating. So what EJS templating is now within our HTML container widgets and our AJAX container widgets, you can actually embed JavaScript within the text contents that you're putting inside of those widgets, and that JavaScript code will actually be processed when the content is displayed. So what that allows us to do is that allows us to actually put in any type of text-based content, and within that we also have access to any of the bound variables within our display or any numeric indicators that may be left from our original RPG applications, as well as access to any data that might be in subfiles. And of course it's very useful for creating dynamic HTML markup, but again it could be used to build any type of text-based content that would need to be displayed. Now, as far as how the templating works, it's actually quite simple. If I jump over here to the Profound UI documentation site, you'll actually see it only takes one page to explain how this works. There are some very specific tags that you use to start and end where your embedded JavaScript code will be. There are various different tags that have slightly different functions. There are tags for if you do not want to actually output anything to the screen, so things for more control type code. There are different modifiers you can put on the end and beginning tags to do things like to actually trim out any leading or trailing spaces, those types of things. But it's actually a very simple system. And of course you have access to JavaScript, so you have access to any of the variables that are available inside the display because they can all be addressed via JavaScript. So here on the documentation you can see some very simple examples where you could, for example, insert data into a table. You can go back and read those at your leisure. This documentation, of course, is available for you to browse at your leisure. So now that I have this capability, the ability to go out and retrieve data from within the Profound UI framework and embed it into these HTML and AJAX containers, how would I use that to actually build content that I would like a framework like Bootstrap to use? Well, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I had never used Bootstrap until I started building this section of this webinar 2 days ago. So I am not an expert when it comes to Bootstrap. There are actually, I'm sure there are some of you in the audience that know much more about it than me, but I gave myself a small crash course and I've built a demonstration on how this can be done. Now keep in mind when we go through this, this is not production level code. I have done a few shortcuts in here in order to keep this simple for the webinar, but I think it will demonstrate the concept pretty easily. So for me, when I started out, I thought the first thing I needed to do was to build what my HTML template is going to look like so that I can get my content organized that I'm going to be using in this example. So for me, lately, for my HTML work, I've been using Visual Studio Code. The new version just came out from Microsoft, and so I'm kicking the tires on it, if you will, to see how I like it. So far, I like it pretty well. So what I did is I built an HTML file just on my desktop. You can see I called it EJS template in this case, and I just started banging away at this HTML code. I used some examples from the web to get an idea of the types of things that I would need to make this work, and we'll kind of step through it. Obviously, the first thing I'm doing here is I have a script tag. I'm actually pulling in jQuery. Bootstrap requires jQuery in order to run, so this is actually pulling in the jQuery files directly from jQuery.com. I don't have to store those on my web server on my IBM-i. I can just go and retrieve them directly from the internet. The same is true of the Bootstrap JavaScript files as well. I'm doing that with the second one here. You'll notice that I have these extra attributes for integrity and cross-origin. Those are just additional attributes that are used to verify that the file that I download hasn't been tampered with. I am downloading them directly from the sources, from their CDNs, but should someone have hacked into there and inserted code that shouldn't be into these two files, because I have a hash of what the total should be, I can double check that and make sure that nothing's been manipulated. I've also, and I admit this is bad form, but again, I told you I made some shortcuts here for the sake of the webinar. I have a style block here, and what I've done is I ran into a couple of CSS classes that had the same names within our framework and within Bootstrap. So I've just gone in and overridden a few things that were within the Profound UI framework, just so that we didn't have conflicts, because things weren't showing exactly the way I wanted to. I've also linked in the Bootstrap CSS file here as well. Again, pulling it directly from their CDN. And once I have those elements taken care of, that's all I need in order to use Bootstrap. So at that point, I just started building out my content. Now, the way Bootstrap works, as far as I understand, again, I'm no expert, is everything is based on containers, which is kind of similar to what we were doing in the Visual Designer anyway. So I have an overall container here that contains all of the content that I'm going to use. Within that, I have rows and columns. That's the way Bootstrap positions things as far as the screen's concerned. So I've defined a row here where I'm going to actually put a navigation bar. You'll see that when we get into the demonstration. And this is just defining my my elements that are within the navigation bar, including down here we have some buttons, one for continue and one for exit. You'll notice that I'm just setting the on-click attributes here, the on-click events, to call the PUI.submit functions, so that it will return control back to my RPG program. Within the second row is where I get into my actual content. This is my image that we had of the product. So I have a class here, and column, have a row class, and then underneath that I have a div that's a column, and I'm setting it to a size of 6. You use these sizes to tell Bootstrap how big certain content is so that it knows what to do with it. And inside of there I've put an image tag. And I've added a special class that Bootstrap uses called image responsive, and that just says that we want this image to be responsive. The second one, I have another column class where I've actually put in all of the labels and the data for our product information. Now you'll notice that, and I didn't point it out on the image, but the same is true up here on the image, that I've used our templating tags here to actually plug the names of the bound fields directly into my HTML. So this will pull whatever value is in the PRID field that's bound inside of this user interface. Same for PR name, PR price, and PR quantity. And then I have a third row that I've implemented here, and this is, of course, is where our subfile information is going to go. However, Bootstrap doesn't like the grid widget within Profound UI. And the reason for that is our grid widget, because it has the advanced functionality that it has, is not implemented as an HTML table. It's actually implemented as nested divs inside the actual HTML that's generated. And that gives us much more control on the things that we can do. So things like having the ability to rearrange columns and to our exporting capabilities, folding subfiles especially. Those types of things are much easier for us to do when we're using divs because we have a little more control over how those things work. However, Bootstrap doesn't work well with that. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm actually going to pull the data out of that subfile, and instead of displaying the grid widget for the subfile, I'm actually going to build just a normal HTML table right here within my template. So as you see, I've just set up my template, my template code for my table, and then when we get into the body of the table, I just have a for loop. And grid3 is the name of the grid widget that contains all of my data. So I'm just going to do a for loop to iterate through all of the rows that are inside of that grid. So I can just take grid3.length, and that will give me the number of rows. And using that for loop, I can go through, I can pull in grid3 sub, whichever row I'm on, and then the field name that from the subfile that I want to pull the data from. So I have a data element here with the name, and then a second element here where I'm putting the image. Now if you remember on our demo application, we had the little icons here with the green check mark or the red X based on whether or not a feature was present on that device. So I wanted to emulate that within my HTML table. So what I did, and this may look a little funny to some of you, is I used a ternary operator in JavaScript just so that I could keep it all in line. So basically this is a conditional statement all within one line. So what I've said here is grid3 sub I dot has feature equals 1. So if has feature is 1 on this row, then we're going to use yes.png. Otherwise, we'll use no.png, which are the names of those two image files that I'm using for those check marks and X's. I could have broken this up and actually had an if statement and curly braces and then plugged in that value, and then I could have had an else and broken all of that out. But in cases like this where you're just trying to insert a conditional piece of text right within a template like this, using a ternary operator just keeps things a little more concise. So one of the really cool things about this is because I'm pulling all of the JavaScript for Bootstrap and the CSS and everything into the template file here, I can actually, and I have it saved on my desktop at this point, so I can actually come in and open this in a web browser and see what it's going to look like. So here on this tab you'll see that I'm just pulling it from my desktop, my EJS_template.html. Now obviously the data is not there, but I can see what the overall layout's going to be as I work on this template before I ever plug it into Profound UI. So obviously this is where my image is going to be, but it has no, because I'm getting the source of the image from that bound variable, it has no idea where it is, so it just gives me a placeholder. I have my item info section that I set up and my labels, and then here are the tags where those individual pieces of data will be pulled in and what the bound field names are. My for loop is going to show up just because the browser has no idea what to do with that code at this point. But you'll see I have my my heading here that says features, and then I have a single row within my table where it's showing me it's going to pull in the name here, and then again a placeholder for that image because I have that conditional statement on which image will be used. So now I can actually see this, use it, play with it until I get it the way I want it to look. I have my continue and my exit buttons that are up here. Those were defined in my nav bar settings, and I can even look at the responsiveness of the application while I'm still working on the template. So you'll notice, for example, as I make this smaller, Bootstrap will actually go ahead and do some things for me to reflow the data. It also takes those navigation buttons for me and wrap those up into a little drop-down menu. Those are all just features of Bootstrap itself, so I didn't have to do anything other than apply the proper CSS classes to the elements that I put on the screen. So once I have this template built and I have things, you know, the way that I want them to look, how do I then get this into a rich display? The process is really quite simple. I'm actually going to clean things up here just a little bit and just start a new record format. So what I would do is I just come in and I would grab a grid, right? I got to have a subfile if I were starting this from scratch, and I'd put my data inside this grid. And once I have it the way I want it, I would actually hide this because I never want to display this grid. And then the other piece is I would just grab from my panels section, you'll find the HTML container widget. And I can put that in, and here on the HTML property, I would just remove what's there, and I would copy the data from my template that I had open in VS Code and just paste it directly into this property. You can even open the editing dialog so that you can make that a little easier to do. Of course, I have this prepared already. So if we take a look at our third record format here, you'll see that it's actually done. And you'll also notice, because we pulled the Bootstrap files inside of that HTML container widget, it's actually going to, much like when we were looking at the template when it was on my desktop, it's actually going to show me some of this formatting. It's not going to be perfect inside the Visual Designer, but it's going to show me most of it. You'll see here I have the original subfile that I've hidden, and then of course I have the HTML container here. So the FE name field and the has feature field are both already in place because of my grid. But the only other content that's on the screen is the HTML container. So if I come here and take a look, you'll see that all of that HTML content that I built before, I've just pasted it directly into Edit HTML. The reason I like to use an external editor to work with it is, while you could come here and do it, and it does attempt to help you with some lines drawn here to show you where tags begin and end, this is just obviously not a full-fledged editor on your Edit HTML dialog here. So anytime you can move out to a real HTML editor, it helps. Whether that's VS Code, you can use Rational Developer. It can handle HTML code just as well. Again, I'm just experimenting with VS Code right now. I kind of like VS Code at the moment for HTML and for JavaScript and Node.js. So that's just where I've been working lately. So we can paste this right in. Now the other problem we have is we have this product information that we have that we need to pull in. So we did that in the HTML code here. We have our JavaScript snippets our EJS snippets to pull them in, but they're not defined anywhere on our user interface at this point. So what I've done here is there's a special property available on all widgets, but I'm just doing it here on the HTML container itself, called user defined data. So I can actually go in and define these fields on the user defined data property. So here's my product ID. They're never displayed anywhere on the screen. They're just attached as just an additional property to put whatever type of data you want. If you need additional, as you can see, I've done 6 so far. You can right-click on user-defined data and choose to add another user-defined data property, and it will. And if I click to this now, it would add user-defined data 7, I could, again, add another bound field so that I would have that data available for the EJS template. So let's take a look at what this would look like if it were actually running. That's really all there is to do this. Now, when you're using another framework, you're going to have to do a lot of this this HTML by hand for some of these things, but most of our customers that are using things like Bootstrap already know how to do that. So if we go back into our demo, let me exit out of version 2 and we can open up version 3. So here we have our application again running inside of Bootstrap, and of course it has the overall styling that is very indicative of a Bootstrap application. But again, Bootstrap can handle the responsiveness of the application for us. We don't have to build the CSS and the media queries to do all of that because Bootstrap already has that built into its framework. So again, as I resize this, we'll see the content, of course, reflow itself and resize accordingly. So that concludes our demo for today. Obviously, the benefits of responsive design are that you can build applications that look good on any size device. As we move forward, more and more of our applications are going to be made available not only on desktops but also on mobile devices. So having these abilities within the product are very important, and again, this is a very common question that we get, so we wanted to make sure that we had a good webinar to address the questions that we've had on this. There are multiple approaches to dealing with responsive design, using the relative positioning, using CSS and media queries, using EJS templating to use other frameworks. Again, we chose Bootstrap because it's the most common question we get. There are many other frameworks out there that you can do responsive design with, so choose whatever you like the most. The main thing is just to find the approach that works best for you, for your environment, for your situation, and to just dive in and get familiar with it and start using it. So again, thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to hand things back over to Amanda for just a moment, and then we will address some of the questions that you guys have entered in here in GoToWebinar. So again, thank you everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. That was a great presentation. Like Brian said, we're going to cover your questions in just a minute, so if you haven't taken the time to submit a question, go ahead and do that now using the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can within the time remaining. Any of the questions we don't get to, we will answer those offline, and then we will submit those when we send you that email. So first step, first things first, next steps, if you're not already using Profound UI, go ahead and download a trial. We have a 30-day no-risk trial. You can go on our website and download that, play around with the Visual Designer and try out some of the cool features and responsive design features that Brian covered today on the webinar. And then, like I mentioned before, check your email. After this webinar, we'll send you a link to the on-demand version of the webinar, and then we'll also send you those code samples that Brian's going to work on, in addition to a question and answer list from the presentation. And then just another reminder, just to complete the post-webinar survey for us when you exit the webinar, just to give us some feedback on what you thought about this topic. And with that, I think we can go ahead, Brian, if you want to take on some of these questions. I think, Brian, you might be muted. There you go.
Yes. So there have been a few questions that have come in, and I will, even though some of our staff have addressed some of those, I'm going to go ahead and address them as well, just so that we have them here on the webinar. So the question came in that would the new templating allow for adaptive design in addition to responsive design? So I think what they're talking about here with adaptive design would be having certain content be displayed or not displayed based on conditions. Very similar to what I was talking about with media queries, where you could have a class for information that would be that you could hide if a screen was below a certain size. Sure, you could do that. With the EJS templating, you could actually have sections of code that are conditioned based on anything that you could detect within the JavaScript. So you could actually retrieve the size of the window there within the JavaScript, and then you could have entire sections of the HTML code that could be conditioned based on that. Let's see, we have, do you have to know the name of the grid as you write the template, or can you create a generic template? You do need to know the name of the grid, because the data in the grid is actually an object within the framework, so you need to be able to reference it. Now, there are things you can do. If you wanted to have this be a little more generic, you could put a rule in and have the grid always have the same name when you're building the screens. So you could always call them responsive grid or grid 1. And then as long as you stuck to that naming convention, yes, you could have a generic template that could access the data, but it can only be so generic. You're still going to need to be able to retrieve the data out of it, so you're going to need the field names. Could you try to introspectively get the field names? Yeah, but then you're getting really complicated. So in theory, you're probably going to have a custom template for a lot of things that you're going to do anyway. Can you use an external HTML file instead of pasting all the code into the designer? Yes, you can do that using the Ajax container. It's a little more involved, so I didn't go into that with the webinar today. I tried to keep it as simple as I possibly could. But yes, that is possible. Let's see. Are the variables only available through the templating language, or can you use them in regular JavaScript files? For example, the grid3 variable used in the HTML. So the variables that we use in this example are only available in the templating language, and that will be available starting with 5.8. Now, keep in mind, though, that the variables that I was using were bound fields. You can use JavaScript to retrieve the values of bound fields within our framework. We have APIs for that already. What you've seen today just makes it easier to do that when you're working in the templating environment. So we've always had the ability to, for example, go out and retrieve the value out of a text box on the field. So you can certainly use just normal JavaScript to retrieve values. But again, today we were concentrating on the templating feature. What does EJS stand for? Honestly, I don't remember. I think it stands for Embedded JavaScript. I'd have to double check it. The EJS templating is actually an open source technology that we brought in. So let me pull up my web browser real quick, and maybe I can get you that answer.
It does stand for Embedded JavaScript.
Yeah, it stands for Embedded JavaScript. Again, that is an open source project that we have incorporated into the framework to allow for that. There is more information available for that. You can actually take a look at embeddedjs.com. We'll take you to the EJS site. And let's see, with that, I guess we are coming up on the top of the hour. Again, if we didn't get to your questions, or the bottom of the hour, I guess. If we didn't get to your questions, we will go back through those, and we will get back to you with any answers that you have. But again, we do thank all of you for attending and for asking such good questions.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and keep an eye out for the email that we'll send. And if you have any questions, just reach out to us. And thanks again for attending our webinar.